Welcome to Coverings Connect. This session will be engaging your clients with virtual reality. Just a couple quick things to get out of the way here. If you've thought about virtual reality and how that might work into your design workflow, if you have any questions, have those in mind, because there will be a period of time where at the end we'll be able to do some question and answer if you have those. Just some quick housekeeping things. If you are a registered architect, this micro unit is eligible for 0.25 CEUs of AIA credit. And the learning objective, because it's a micro unit, is only one learning objective. And you should be able to come away from this being able to describe how you could apply using virtual reality as a tool in your design process. My name is Scott Nichols. I'm a brand strategist. I have my own consultancy called Graphaus Design. I collaborate with architects, interior designers, contractors, companies, corporations, and brands, and defining their brand and translating it into three-dimensional space. So that's branded environments. And VR is a tool that we've had a lot of success incorporating in the design process. It really helps engage the client in the process early on in the process while decisions can still be made and changes can be made and input can be implemented successfully. So I consult on a wide range of technology, 3D printing, augmented reality, VR, drones, and laser scanning for companies in the AEC industry, architects, engineers, and contractors. But whenever I do a presentation on technology, I like to stress that technology on its own isn't sufficient. And I believe it was Steve Jobs that said that the best breakthroughs happen and the best user experiences happen at the crossroads of technology and the humanities. So I always like to frame conversations with that because it doesn't do any good to just focus on the piece of technology. So with that, before we jump into the topic, there are three things that are affecting all industries right now. Whether you're an architect or a designer, interior designer, or if you are a restaurateur and you have a chain of restaurants that you're trying to launch. And I'm just going to talk about these briefly. So technology is expanding at an exponential rate. The tools that you use today will probably be different 6 months from now. That's why I don't like to focus solely on the tools, but focus on how they're integrated into the design thinking process. The second thing that's affecting all industries is what they term as the Amazon effect. And in a nutshell, because people purchase on Amazon, they're used to what Jeff Bezos terms as a frictionless experience, and that's the thing that they constantly focus on is how can I make the client interaction as frictionless as possible? And if you've used Amazon, you can quickly search for what you're looking for, find the lowest price, and it'll arrive to your door the next day. But why that's important is it's affecting all industries, whether you're an architect or an interior designer. Those customer expectations, they carry those throughout all of their purchasing decision-making processes. And that's why you might find that clients seem to expect things even faster than they used to. So that's an important overlay. So you have technology, you have the Amazon effect, and we're currently in what author Joseph Pine terms as the experience economy, and what Seth Godin, who's a marketing guru, refers to it as the connection economy. What that simply means is we're definitely in a post-industrial revolution marketplace, and we're far beyond the service economy. And what that means is everybody's experiencing this situation where whether you're an architect or you're a restaurant or you're a corporation, user experience is becoming more and more important because everybody can find the lowest price. So companies have to strive even harder to create engaging experiences for their clients. So that extends to the service industries such as architects and interior designers. And the same is true, I keep going back to restaurant examples because I'm going to talk about one here in a moment, but the days of people being satisfied by going to a chain restaurant that looks exactly like the other chain restaurant that they ate at in another city, people want unique experiences. So that's why you're seeing, specifically in the restaurant industry, where these smaller brands, which I call micro brands, are taking off. And usually what happens, they open one location, they achieve a lot of success, and they want to open another location, and they're constantly searching for ways to capture that magic and scale it up instead of just doing the chain restaurant model. So as you know, the session is about virtual reality, so we're going to talk about that. And I'm going to do this by diving into a specific example. Before I jump into that, the example I'm going to talk about is going to be a restaurant, but I've used this with architectural teams in their client interactions. I've used it on residential projects where we bring the client in early in the schematic design phase, and they can actually walk around and experience the space early in the schematic design phase, where there's actually time to make changes. And why that's important is I think designers inherently think spatially. And so when they look at a floor plan, they can kind of imagine what the space is going to feel like, how it's going to look. Interiors, people can usually look at a finish board and imagine what that would look on an entire wall. But I kind of turn that as a blind spot that professionals have, because if you can think spatially, you kind of take that for granted. And when you interact with your clients and you're just pointing to a space on a floor plan and showing them a finish board, they're not always visualizing it the same way that you do. And where virtual reality really helps in the design process is you can bring your client into the space. They can quickly get a sense of spatial relationships. They can get a sense of what that carpet pattern is going to look like when it's actually on the floor in the big space. And it starts to mitigate those experiences where the walls start to go up on a project and the client shows up on site and they go, oh, I thought this was going to feel much bigger. This feels really small. So you can get to that phase of the reaction in the schematic design phase before anything starts with construction. And again, the same is true for materials too. A lot of times it looks great on a finished board when it's a little square of tile, but then when it's on an entire wall, sometimes there's a little bit of a recoil, like, wow, I didn't know it was going to be that blue, or the pattern's a little busy. You can get to that using virtual reality as a tool. So the client that I'm going to highlight is, this is a local restaurant chain, and similar to what I was talking about before, they're a micro brand. They opened their first location, I think, back in 2008, and they've been on Inc.'s Fast 5000 list, and they're number 25 in the Orlando area for fast-growing companies. So they started with their one location in 2007, 2008. They're on track to have 20 locations by the end of next year. And they've expanded outside of Florida. I think they have 5 locations in Florida, another one opening in South Florida, but they've just opened a location in Charleston and Atlanta. So they're growing at a rapid pace, which is great, but the thing that they had been struggling with is they had that magic at that original location, but now how do they scale that up and still render authentic experiences that are unique to each of the locations, but still maintain their brand integrity? So in my conversations with them and the design team, the thing that they kind of landed on, so just to give you some background, their whole restaurant concept is based on Asian street food. So they have a wide range of menu items. They have Thai food, they have Chinese food, Japanese food, Korean food, Malaysian, a lot of Malaysian dishes. It's also a lot of family recipes. So they really focus on the food having an being authentic to Asian street food, and also the environment conveying that. And having design conversations with them about what they think their brand is. They like for people to come to the restaurant and have that sense of adventure that you might have if you were to go to Bangkok and walk through the street market. So that's a little bit tricky because you want the space to convey that kind of feeling, but you also want it to feel clean, but they also want it to feel like a little bit dangerous and adventurous as well. So there's some tricky things to balance, and in our conversations, one of the things we kept coming back to, for those of you that are familiar with the film Blade Runner, at nighttime, the Blade Runner scenes are all about the lighting, and it's very much influenced by Asian street markets, and you have the neon lighting and things like that. So they really like that nighttime aesthetic and utilizing lights to create that ambiance. And doing the design research, I found that there's several bars that have done this as a concept, which is great because they're primarily only open at night. But the trick is when the lights, for a restaurant that's open during the daytime, when the lights are on, it needs to still feel authentic and not look like this themed thing that, now the lights on, it kind of looks weird. So what we really focused on was how the space would look at nighttime and how it would look during the daytime with natural light. So at nighttime, we're focusing on using lighting and materials to create that Blade Runner type street market mood. But during the daytime, the material palette's kind of natural materials that are worn and rusticated. And so this type of thing, through a traditional design process, you could show this type of imagery and talk to the client and kind of show them this area of the floor plans where we'll use this material, but still you have the disconnect where they may not be able to imagine it spatially. So by utilizing VR, we're able to show them these transitions from nighttime to daytime so they could get a real feeling of what these materials would look like and how the transition would happen from daytime to nighttime to achieve that. Now, the trick with virtual reality right now is it's kind of a single person experience. When we do these design sessions, we would load the model up, and one person would put the headset on at a time, and then we would display on the screen so everybody else in the meeting could see what that person was seeing. So there's still some interaction, but it's kind of independent, which also makes it tricky for doing a presentation on virtual reality, especially in 30 minutes. If we had a longer session, I would have had something set up and everybody could experience it. So these are just some quick special moment views of the project, just showing the transition from daytime to nighttime. And again, so when we did this session, we weren't showing them stills. They were actually walking around the project. There's some headsets, some VR headsets that are kind of fixed point. You put it on, and all you can do is kind of turn in one spot. But I use the HTC Vive, which allows the participant to walk around in about a 15 by 15 foot maximum area, so they can really get a sense of how the space feels. They can get a sense for the proximity of objects, and that can come into functional elements of the project. They could stand at the hostess station and see. They can even test reaching, like, okay, well, if the menus are here, is that in a convenient location? So they can really work through some operational aspects. And this type of thing has also been used on healthcare projects, for example, where we'd set up a meeting with the nurses, and they could put on the headset and see from their nurses station, how are the sight lines? Can I see all the patient rooms that I'm responsible for? They can even, to a certain extent, test out travel distances, which are very important. Same is can be true for courthouse projects too. Sight lines are very important. You could sit in the jury box and see what their experience is. And what this is beginning to do on those types of projects, what you would have sometimes if they're larger scale projects, they would do a virtual mock-up and actually build out with plywood to actual dimensions of what a courtroom would be, or a nurse's station or a nurse's area, which incurs a lot of expense, but on a larger project you can kind of absorb that. But the firms that I've worked with who have been implementing this have been realizing that the virtual model has almost been sufficient. I had one client who shared an experience with me where they built the courtroom mock-up, they had it ready to go, and then they walked everybody through the physical mock-up first, and then brought them over to VR, and then experienced the space that way, and they could see the materials and things like that. They had somebody who arrived late to the meeting, and he went right to the VR first. He put on the headset. He's like, oh, wow, this is great. I think it was the clerk of courts, and he was giving them great feedback. He's like, okay, that's awesome. And they're like, oh, well, we have the actual physical mock-up too, and he was like, he was satisfied with just that experience that he had. So going back to that point that I was making about not just solely focusing on the technology, a lot of companies and firms are starting to integrate virtual reality because it's the new tech thing. But again, I really like to stress good processes, because the rate that technology is moving right now, again, the tools that you're using now will probably completely change and evolve later on. So to illustrate that, I always like to compare Pixar and DreamWorks as an example, because they both basically do the same thing in theory as far as the technology that they use. They both use rendering programs to create these feature-length animations. They were both founded about the same time. And if you go back and look just as kind of a measure of quality and storytelling, DreamWorks since 1998 had 32 films with 16 Oscar nominations, which resulted in 3 Oscar wins, where Pixar started just a couple years earlier. They had fewer films, 16, had 24 nominations, which resulted in 12 Oscars. So I always like to reinforce the importance of storytelling and process in addition to how you utilize the technology. So as a percentage, DreamWorks 32 films resulted in 10% in Oscars as far as what the ratio worked out to, where Pixar was at 75%. So just reiterating again, the technology is not alone isn't sufficient on its own. It's about the processes and workflows. And what I'm really trying to stress here is this is a great tool to engage your clients early in the design process. Definitely when you can get them involved with the schematic design phase, it's much easier to make changes. And the workflows are so fluid. If you're in Revit or SketchUp, you can even move things around on the fly. You can have 2 different options set up. I've been in design sessions with architects and clients where the architect had a preferred scheme that they liked because it spatially made more sense. But when they were in their client meetings and they were trying to nudge the client in that direction, they met some resistance because that scheme was going to cost a little bit more money. And when they tried to explain to the client the spatial qualities and the tools that they were using were still renderings and floor plans, the client really wasn't getting it. So I encouraged them to say, hey, bring your client in, let's bring them into both schemes and have them experience both spaces and see what happens. And the client experienced the preferred scheme, and then he experienced the one that he was leaning towards, and then by the end of the session, hands down, he was sold on the preferred scheme that the architects wanted. And it's simply because he was able to experience spatially. The other thing that I've seen too with VR is when you bring clients in early, they get to actually experience the space before it's built. So if you have a tile or a material or a carpet that is really going to make the project special, in traditional processes, you might get to the end of the design development or construction document phase, and then you're going out for pricing, and budget cuts need to be made. Through the old process, the client would look at the spreadsheet, and the contractor would go, well, that tile's $100 a square foot. We can get a cheaper tile. And when you're just evaluating numbers, it's pretty easy for a client to go with the more inexpensive option. But what I found is if you can get a client to come into the design early in the process and actually experience the space, they get attached to the idea of that space. So it's much easier to defend design integrity because they're factoring in that personal experience they had versus just comparing numbers on a spreadsheet. So before we jump into questions, I always like to throw this quote in at the end of presentations. It's attributed to a Native American proverb, although the origin's kind of murky, but I picked this up from Shane Snow, who's an author of a book called Smart Cuts. And it's simply those who tell the stories rule the world. And I think as designers, good designers are always telling stories. And I think that the technology that you implement are simply tools to allow you to tell better stories and really sell that design narrative. So it's not just the technology, it's the design thinking process that you're using, it's the level of engagement that you're bringing the client in, and it's the level of authenticity that you can render within that experience. So with that, if there's any questions, the floor is open for questions. Please complete the session evaluation. You can find that on the app. And those are the directions for that. So.
What kind of programs are you using to do the virtual reality?
So I've primarily been using a SketchUp workflow with a plugin called it's a third-party plugin, Enscape. But it also works for, it now works for Lumion, and it also works for Revit, and they have a plugin for Rhino as well. And the reason for that is just a faster workflow. And like for some of the situations that I was describing, you could have like in a residential project, a client could say, well, what if the bed was over here? You could quickly move it in the model and it updates, and then they can experience the space. It's just very fast and iterative. You can do the same thing with Revit, but Revit's just a little more robust. So, Enscape. Mm-hmm. Anyone else? Is there anything I would recommend as far as? Oh. Yeah, so if you wanted to, and you know that your space is so many square feet, and you could simply build the walls, and you could just have a floor surface, and you could model that. A lot of the manufacturers now are really good about having materials online, and then the workflow that I was mentioning before. It's very easy to take, if it's a JPEG image, bring those in, create a material, and the tools allow you to add roughness or glossiness. So if you bring the image in and it's not quite right, the material editor is really good, where you can really dial in what that sample would actually look like with reflectivity, or if it's matte, things like that. But then you could scale it and have it down on the floor, and you could get a sense of if the pattern's going to be too overwhelming or not, or if it's the scale of it's not quite right for the scale of the space. Anyone else? How are we doing on time? Did I go too fast? Huh? That's it? All right, thank you.